Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about fragmentation and the shadow. Alright, so since today's video is all about fragmentation and the shadow, let me talk a little bit about the shadow first to give you a clear snapshot of what the shadow is like. Now, one of the main ways that I see the shadow depicted, and one of the main misconceptions around the shadow, is that it tends to be seen as this singularity that exists within the unconscious, sort of almost like its own being, with all of our darkest and worst impulses. And the idea is that the parts of ourselves that are in shadow are these inherently bad parts. And the reason why it's in the shadow is because we can't really face with those parts of ourselves, because they're so negative. But the reality of the matter is that the shadow is really more like a place. So in the same way that you can have a shadowy place, a place where the light doesn't shine in reality, the shadow is kind of the aspect within our psyche, or the place within our psyche where the light of consciousness doesn't shine. And so whenever there are aspects of ourself that we repress away, that we reject, that we deny, that end up getting split off from our conscious awareness, they get put away in the shadow where the light of consciousness doesn't shine. But it isn't as though those parts of ourselves are inherently bad or dark or evil. A lot of times these aspects can be repressed for a multitude of other reasons, like we experience a trauma, or we have an unmet need, or we end up defining our self-concept in such a way where we say, I am this and I am not that. And so these parts of ourselves end up in the place that is the shadow. So in the same way that I could take this pencil and I could stick it into a dark closet and it's going to be shrouded in darkness, it's going to be in shadow. But I could also take this same pencil out of that closet and into the light of day, and now the light would be shining on it. It is the same way with our shadow aspects. The parts of ourselves that end up in the shadow are kind of put in the dark closet of the psyche. But we can go into that dark closet, bring those parts of ourselves out of the dark closet and integrate them into the light of our conscious awareness. And so with the aspects of ourselves that end up in the place of the shadow, they're not necessarily inherently dark or bad. They're actually quite neutral. And when we bring them out of that dark closet that is the shadow, then when the light of consciousness shines upon them, they tend not to behave in as detrimental of a fashion as they do while they're in the darkness, while they're in the shadow. So basically, the shadow is kind of the place within the unconscious where we sweep the perceived dirt of the personality. It's not the actual dirt of the personality, but the perceived dirt of the personality. So the shadow is more like a place than like a being. So with that in mind about the shadow, let me talk about fragmentation. So fragmentation is the process by which parts of the personality get split off and cast into the shadow. And one of the things that's very important to realize about fragmentation is that when these aspects end up down in the shadow, it isn't as though we're just putting individual traits down there. So let's say that I notice in myself that, oh, I have some greedy tendencies. It's not as though I'm taking greed and then putting it in the shadow. What has to happen in order for me to repress something or to push something down into the shadow is I actually have to cut off a whole entire aspect of myself that becomes its own little mini personality. And so these are really like personality fragments that end up in that dark closet of the shadow. And so with these personality fragments, just like the conscious personality has its own wants, needs, and agenda, these aspects have their own wants, needs, and agendas. And so what happens is that these aspects are very much us, but when they end up in the shadow, they act as their own free agent, and they kind of go rogue from the rest of the personality. And so the aspects of ourself that we're conscious of, the conscious personality, the parts of ourselves that we call me or I when we're referring to ourselves, we might want and need certain things, and then these other aspects that end up down in the shadow basically have their own agendas, that might, go along with the conscious personality's agenda or might not go along with the conscious personality's agenda. And so essentially what ends up happening when we're dealing with fragmentation and these parts of ourselves that are put in the shadow is that we have kind of a vehicle with multiple steering wheels. And so with the conscious personality, we're trying to go in certain directions. We're like, oh, I want this and I need that, and oh, I would like to start my own business, or I want to have a good relationship, or, you know, I want to be more productive, or whatever it happens to be. So the conscious personality wants this, but these aspects that end up down in the shadow might end up having other ideas, and it might feel like the wants and needs and goals of the conscious personality are going to be antithetical to their own agendas. And so what might happen is that these aspects might go, no, we're going to hold back on that. No, you're going to procrastinate. No, there's going to be self-sabotage, because these aspects are trying to steer that vehicle in their own direction. So we're like a vehicle with many steering wheels. There's the one that the conscious personality is driving, and there are the steering wheels that are invisible to the conscious personality that these shadow aspects are driving. And this is really why when we think about the shadow and how it shows up, it tends to show up in pretty problematic ways. And the reason why the shadow is, let's say, related so much to this image of darkness is because it's trying to do its own thing and trying to go in the direction it wants to go in. The conscious personality is trying to go in the direction that it wants to go in. And when those things clash, or when those things end up interacting in a negative way, we can end up with some pretty gnarly results. You know, we can also end up like displaying quite a few negative coping mechanisms as a result of the shadow as well, or ending up in bad relationship patterns, or ending up doing some kind of self-destructive behavior. And so these aspects that exist autonomously in the dark closet of the shadow, they have their own sort of self-interest that's also your own self-interest, but it is so disconnected from the conscious personality's self-interest that these things tend to create a pretty negative sort of chemical reaction together. And so that's why really the shadow is related to negativity so much. But it is only because these aspects are unconscious to us that they display themselves in negative ways. When there's integration and communication between these aspects, we can really go in a very positive direction. And so shadow work is really, really great for, let's say, getting all of your aspects on board and getting them all moving in the same direction so that there's no self-sabotage, or there's no, let's say, unconscious like engaging in self-destructive patterns and relationship cycles and things like this. And so when it comes to integrating these aspects, we have to understand why they were cast into the shadow in the first place. You know, and there are four main reasons that I've found why aspects generally end up in the shadow. And so I'll go through those really quick. So basically we have the ego preservation type of repression, where aspects of ourself get split off from the conscious personality and stuck into the dark closet of the shadow because we have a certain idea about who we are versus who we aren't. And we identify with certain things and we say, I am this way and I am not that way. And so it's these small decisions that we make about our ego, about our identity, about who we are versus who we aren't. And whenever we so strongly identify with a particular thing, we may tend to repress away things that are seen as antithetical or opposite in some way to that. So let's say if I identify with being hardworking and that becomes, let's say, a cornerstone of my identity, then I may have a tendency to push away any aspect of myself that may be telling me that I need to slow down, or that wants to take things slowly, or maybe certain aspects of me that might be, let's say, wanting more rest, because I might be labeling them in a negative way, like, oh, that's just laziness and that's negative. And so what I might do is I might hyper-identify with this hardworking aspect of my personality to the exclusion of any aspect that gets in the way of that identification or seems to threaten that identification. So that's one reason why aspects end up repressed and into the shadow. Now, when it comes to integrating aspects that have been repressed and put in the dark closet of the shadow as a result of, let's say, the attempts to preserve a certain identity or ego structure, what we have to do is we have to get into a space where we have disidentified with, or at least gotten some distance from our identification with whatever it is we are identifying with, so that we can hold space for whatever the opposite of that thing is within the personality. So if we have identified ourselves with passivity, we have to also hold space for the other side of the polarity of aggressiveness. If we have hyper-identified with creativity, we also have to open up and hold space for what we would consider the opposite of that, perhaps pragmatism or, practicality of some kind. So essentially, we have to hold space for the opposites within ourselves. And so we have to look at the elements within ourselves that we're very strongly identified with and think, well, what are the things that I would consider opposite to or antithetical to that identification? And then being able to hold space for those parts of ourselves, recognize those parts of ourselves. And if we find it difficult to do that with a particular polarity, then that's probably a sign that there's some shadow material in relation to that. And so let's say, if I go with passivity and aggressiveness, so if I hyper-identify with passivity and I kind of exalt it up and I think like, oh, passivity means that you're a pacifist and it means you're a better person if you, are very laid back and this kind of thing. And then it's, oh, if you're aggressive, then that just means that you're an angry person and no one's going to like you and you're a bad person, or, whatever the mindset is, you can look and see, okay, how do you integrate that other polarity? How do you integrate your assertiveness, the aspect of yourself that can push back on things, that has some of the positive qualities of aggression? And so I would think, oh, has there been somebody in my life that's been really aggressive that I'm trying to not be like? Or have there been situations where I have been, let's say, dealt with things with aggression and then that ended up disastrous, and so I have a hard time even connecting a little bit to that opposite side of the spectrum. And so looking at things like this can be very helpful for us in widening out our self-concept to hold space for these opposites, or to be able to recognize the aspects of ourself that we would typically label as undesirable or bad. Another reason is worldview preservation. So worldview preservation has a lot to do with ego preservation, because oftentimes our egos or our identities are based heavily on, let's say, certain paradigms, certain worldviews, and the way that things work. So for example, if I am the pharaoh in ancient Egypt, my identification as the pharaoh requires me to have a very specific worldview. So I have to believe in a very particular cosmology and a very specific way that reality works in order for the title of pharaoh to have a certain meaning. And so if I've been indoctrinated into believing that I am the pharaoh, then anything that seems to, let's say, kind of threaten that general worldview and cosmology will be very, very threatening to the maintenance of that ego structure. And so that's like one example. But ultimately, everyone is indoctrinated into a particular idea about the way that the world is and how the universe works. And so ultimately, anything within us that falls outside of the range of that worldview, or any aspect of reality that falls outside of the range of that worldview, might feel quite threatening to our ego preservation drive, which is very, very strong. So understanding that ego preservation and worldview preservation are very, very similar in that way, and both have that same kind of pattern of, I am this way, I am not that way. Reality is this way, reality is not that way. Thus, putting on our blinders to any aspects of ourself or reality that might threaten that identification with the ego. Now, when it comes to integrating aspects of ourselves that have been repressed because of worldview preservation, we have to look and we have to take stock of what our worldview is in the first place. And we also have to see, what we're identifying with so strongly and the emotional reasons that underlie that identification. And also, if there are certain interpretations of reality that really rub us the wrong way, we have to look and see emotionally why that rubs us the wrong way. And oftentimes it's because the ego is at the crux of that discomfort. So if let's say that I was raised in a very religious kind of family, in a religious society, and everything was really based around this one particular worldview, and that was like the paradigm from which everyone was kind of firing. And so I built my identity in relation to that. I have my ideas of what's good or bad in relation to that. My social circle is all wrapped up in that worldview. And so if I think about, number one, what would be so scary about opening things up from that worldview and looking beyond that worldview? It's like, well, there's the potential for being socially outcast or, disapproved of by the greater society. So that could be one reason why the worldview is so strong. Also, if a person, let's say if I'm in this space of like, there's this religious worldview and I've built my idea of what's good and what's bad and what's valuable and what's not valuable based on that, chances are that my self-esteem is being scaffolded upon that worldview. And so let's say if it's a Christian worldview, and I think, okay, well, these are the good things to do and these are the bad things not to do. And so if I do these good things, then I'm a good person, or if I do these bad things, then I'm a bad person. If that worldview were to be upended in some kind of way, then that kind of puts me into a spin in terms of, oh, how am I then going to determine that I'm a good person if that worldview comes out from under me? So it can be quite a scary thing to lose the worldview. And I have actually met several people in my life that have dealt with a crisis of faith and things like that. And it's been described as almost like having the rug pulled out from under you, because the universe is so mysterious, and we have these ways of understanding the universe that gives us a sense of certainty and comfort. And so whenever we start to question our worldview, or whenever our worldview gets yanked out from under us, that can be very scary, because not only is our sense of grounding within the reality based on it, also our ego structure, our identity, our sense of self is very tightly interwoven with that. And so the big thing about integrating these aspects that are kept away from the conscious personality because of the worldview is in being able to be more comfortable with uncertainty, being able to connect to that sense of not knowing and recognizing that any understanding of reality that we have can never be 100% for sure. And so it's in that holding space for the uncomfortable emotions that surround uncertainty and being able to embrace the mysteries of reality that enable us to really connect with these aspects that have been repressed as a result of worldview preservation drives. All right, now the third reason why an aspect might get repressed into the shadow is trauma. And the way that I define trauma is basically anything that creates an emotion that is too big to process at a given time. So if we can think about trauma in terms of, or emotion I should say, if we can think about emotion in terms of water. So let's say that we have the capacity to drink 1 glass of water at a time. And a trauma is like if we experience so much more water than what we can actually drink at one given time. So if I can drink an 8-ounce glass of water, but a trauma is like giving me a bucket of water. So I couldn't possibly drink it all at one time. And so what has to happen is that essentially the trauma response has to come in, take that bucket of water, all of that unprocessable emotion, and has to store it away for later, where it gets kind of locked into the body. And so we can actually revisit that trauma and process through it later. But along with pushing away that emotion, what happens is that the trauma response also comes in, cuts off an aspect of our personality, and sticks it in the shadow. And so the aspect of ourself that is dealing with that emotion that's hanging out in the body that can't be processed is also put into the shadow. And this is done so that we can move on from the situation, so that we can continue to cope through our lives and really focus toward what's going positively for us. And so whenever it comes down to connecting with these aspects, we have to really feel into those emotions. We have to really be able to, let's say, have emotional proximity with these aspects. So if we have an aspect of ourselves that, let's say, dealt with some kind of loss and is now dealing with grief, and so the trauma response came in, cut that aspect of ourself off, and put it into the dark closet of the shadow. And so this aspect will be in that dark closet of the shadow, consistently kind of cycling around with that feeling of grief that's unprocessed. Whereas the conscious personality will be above the line of consciousness and not consciously feeling that grief. And so in order for us to integrate aspects that have ended up down in the shadow, we have to seek emotional proximity with these aspects, meaning that we have to allow ourselves to feel the emotions, the uncomfortable emotions that these aspects are cycling around with. In this case, it would be grief. So the conscious personality would have to bring itself down to connect with this aspect through that emotion, and that creates that line of communication that allows this aspect to really process through those feelings, to let go of those feelings. And once those feelings are processed through, that aspect can then come back into integration with the conscious personality. So that's the third reason. Now, the fourth reason why an aspect might end up down in the shadow is because it has unmet needs. And so with unmet needs, what ends up happening is that there is something that we need and we just did not get it. And these are not needs in the sense of like food and water where we'll die without them, but they are needs in terms of being able to keep connection with aspects of ourselves. So let's take, for example, if there is part of ourself that really needed validation from our parents. And so this is like a basic human need here for validation. But let's say the parents really either weren't able to or were unwilling to give the child the validation that they needed. What ends up happening then is that this is a very intense situation to be in when you have a need, an emotional need, and there's no outlet to get it met. And so what happens in order for us to be able to cope and to focus on what's going well and to be able to move on with our life without being so hung up on one particular need that can't be met, what happens is this aspect again gets cut off from the conscious personality, put down in the shadow where again it's cycling around looking for that need to be met. And so this aspect is in the dark closet of the shadow saying, where is that need? Where is that need? You know, so in this case, where is my validation from my parents? Where is my validation from my parents? And over again through that cycle. And so this is happening down in the shadow while the conscious personality can move on and focus on other things. But when it comes to getting integration with this aspect of yourself, it'll have to do with being able to sit with those very uncomfortable feelings of desperation so that you can connect and see what the need is. Oftentimes with unmet needs, it can be very difficult to integrate these aspects because we get used to functioning without those needs being met. And without any contrast, if we've never had those needs met before, we might not even realize we have an unmet need in the first place. And so what happens is that we have to first connect with this aspect by feeling that sense of desperation and that sense of longing for that need to be met. And then we have to find ways both internally to meet it by orienting to ourselves, and let's say in this case in a validating way. Can the conscious personality orient to this shadow aspect in a validating way? But then also setting up situations in the external where you build relationships with people who are validating, or you meet whatever it is that this aspect happens to need. You know, could be something else other than validation. So essentially, with the unmet needs, you have to connect with it, feel those uncomfortable emotions, and then find ways to both internally and externally meet those needs. So in a nutshell, that's what it entails to integrate the shadow. But of course, there's a lot of other particularities that have to be taken into account. So each shadow aspect has to be taken almost as its own little personality that has its own needs, just in the same way every person would have their own needs. So to integrate each aspect, you have to develop that direct relationship with them and be able to embrace them in the way that it needs to be embraced. Now, if you would like to to learn more about the practicalities of shadow work and shadow integration in particular, and how to implement them in your own shadow work practice, I highly recommend signing up for my 13-week shadow work group class. I'll go ahead and I'll leave the link down below in the description box, and there you can see the schedule and basically what all you get in the class. But as like a brief rundown, you basically get 13 videos. These are exclusive content from which you'll find on my channel. 13 weekly assignments to help with the shadow work practice along with it. And then there's also a once a week, hour-and-a-half long meeting for 13 weeks. And basically, in that meeting, I cover things that are even unique from things that are in the course content and unique from on the channel as well. And you get also one-on-one session with me. So that's basically what the 13-week group class is all about. And the reason why I've created the group class is that I found when I first started looking into shadow work, there were a lot of questions that I had, and it felt like there weren't a lot of practical solutions. I could understand it on a very theoretical kind of level, almost as an academic study. But for me, it was really important when I created this course to make it something that's very practical, very useful, that anybody can look at and understand what they have to do, where they can identify their shadow aspects and figure out why those aspects were repressed and figure out what motivates those aspects, so that you can work with those aspects more effectively and effectively bring them back into the loop of the conscious personality. So I'll go ahead and I'll leave the link to that down below in the description box if you're interested, and also leave a link in the comments section as well. So anyway, that's all I have for you for today, and I hope that you enjoyed the video, and until next time, keep becoming more you.